Good afternoon. So the echo is away. Good afternoon. Who gives you an idea that it's election year and that it's 2 weeks away? So you're allowed to throw things. It must be of value. So, no insults. Welcome. This is the 14th year of Nation in Conversation. It is a platform where dialogue takes place, where we inform and where we listen to each other. South Africans are incredible people. You can take that statement in any way you like, but I say it in a positive way. South Africans are incredible people. We'll get through this as we got through anything else. Maybe there's a little bit too much noise around it. The next morning the sun will come up and we'll go on. But it is of significance, and you'll hear today we have a very esteemed panel. Waldemar, you and your panel, we really look forward to it. And maybe the best thing that we can do in an election year is to take somebody with who hasn't voted. Take somebody with who hasn't voted. Convince them. So enjoy the day. It's a full house. Please put off your cell phones. Please don't go in and out. If you're here, stay or leave now. All right. We're a full house. Is your aircon full on? All right, we're just going to give a short introductory video just to give context. And then Waldemar, as we know it, he will turn up the heat. So enjoy it. Thank you.
Corruption, state capture, failing SOEs, stagnant economic growth, non-existent service delivery, load shedding, the water crisis, failure to implement policies. For many South Africans, this characterizes their Mzansi. But we know it's not as simple as that. A growing fiscal deficit, underfunding at local government level, providing services to millions of previously underserved citizens, the transformation imperative. These are all challenges our government has been up against since the dawn of democracy. But how do we bridge the gap between the picture we see today and our dreams for tomorrow? In a democracy, our power lies in our vote. Out of a population in excess of 62 million people, it's estimated there are roughly 42.3 million eligible voters in South Africa. However, only 27.79 million of these have registered to vote on the 29th of May. Voter turnout will only be one of many issues in the spotlight when considering how our political landscape influences the economy, policy decisions, and service delivery.
The election of 29 May is going to be a very, very significant election. It's 30 years since the 1994 election, when this democratic project actually started, but this year we have 2 or 3 things that will be different. One is the dominant party, the ANC, is looking at a declining support. We're not exactly sure where it will end, but everything points to the fact that they may be able to reach 50% of the vote or below, but not higher than that. A second thing that is very important is that we have several parties that is contesting for the position of second place and third place. And then the biggest surprise of this election, of course, was the emergence of MK in the form of a party led by Jacob Zuma, and that is making things very interesting in terms of predicting the outcome. The 2019 election was all about land reform. The 2019 election was all about expropriation without compensation. This year, political parties are worried about other things, such as load shedding. Political parties are worried about service delivery in general. They are worried about water. Now, all of those things impact on agriculture, but it is not specifically aimed at agriculture. So I think if we compare the 2024 election to the 2019 election, I think there are less focus on agriculture, and I think the outcome of the election will provide a much better environment for agriculture to do their lobbying and to do their influencing and to make sure that we have food security in South Africa.
70 political parties and 11 independents have succeeded in submitting nominations. 15 political parties are contesting all tiers of the elections, and in total there are over 14,903 candidates vying for 887 seats in the National Assembly and provincial legislatures.
It's highly likely that we will have a coalition government after the 2024 provincial and national elections. Reason being that most polls are predicting that the ANC will fall below 50%, which means that the ANC will require a partner or partners to fill up the gap to cross to 50 plus 1%. So if the ANC were to need a coalition partner, who would that be? If the fall is so deep, which in my view is unlikely, the ANC would need either the DA or the EFF to cooperate with. If the fall is minor, the ANC might just require a 1 or 2% party, parties that it had cooperated with before or it is cooperating with now. On the issues that these elections are being fought on, the ANC's poll was spot on in 2022, that the elections are actually fought on in terms of service delivery issues, jobs, in terms of crime, and all of those issues that people worry about, load shedding, general sentiments in the country being negative at the moment towards the ANC. This is the new era of South African politics. We are entering into real democratic practice now, where after the election, it's not clear who becomes government. And I think that kind of politics is good for the country. It would lead to more accountability in future. If you are in government, you don't know whether you will come back, so you must perform.
The outcome of the elections can have significant implications for the South African agricultural sector's growth, transformation and sustainability.
So agriculture functions in a highly complex socio-economic environment. And the reason for that is we work with different cultures and we live together as different cultures. So when you have a very important event like the political event of 29th of May this year, there's always the tendency that you can polarize the agricultural environment. And why do we say this? Agriculture itself is also divided politically. So you have different parties with different manifestos and different mandates. And the tendency with politicians is to utilize agriculture for their own benefit, but actually polarize agriculture. And that's not what we want. So we want to have a democratic election come 29th of May. And we want to have a peaceful election come 29th of May. As agriculture, we need to stand together and we need to live together and work together to do whatever we like to do, and that's to farm. That's to serve South Africans in a greater way. So may we have a peaceful elections 29th of May 2024.
Amidst the uncertainty, farmers and agricultural stakeholders play a critical role in shaping the political agenda and advocating for their interests. If we believe that it's our democracy, we must play our role in shaping it.
Recording live from Nampo. It's my great privilege to welcome a fantastic panel today. All of us have been in conversations like these, but not quite like this, for many, many years. Today it's exactly 2 weeks before the election. To my right is Wandile Sihlobu, Chief Economist at AgBiz and also a lecturer at Stellenbosch University. Wandile, though, claims to be living in Pretoria, but he commutes. Lucky man, best of both worlds. Muletsi Mveki, welcome, the chairman of the South African Institute of International Affairs and a long-time esteemed commentator, very brave commentator sometimes on South African affairs. Muletsi, welcome. Lovely to see you again. Isaac Mosheku is Chief Economist at Nedbank, who will also host a media lunch after today's session. Isaac, thank you for joining us. And JP Landman is an independent analyst who also sometimes bucks the trend in commentary on South African issues. JP, lovely to see you.
Thank you.
I'm going to start not with agriculture and start with the NHI. The NHI Act, Muletsi, is to be signed at 2 p.m. today by the President at the Union Buildings, less than an hour from now. Does the ANC believe that this will be a vote winner for them, that people will think this will solve these service delivery problems that Mpumelelo mentioned?
Well, I don't think many South Africans think the ANC government is capable of delivering anything. NHI, water, railways, electricity. So I think if they believe the population, anyone believes that they can deliver universal health care for the country, I think they're fooling themselves. The problem I think we, or sections of South Africa, let me correct myself, is they go out traveling all over the world and then they see something in one of these foreign places and they think, well, my country should have this. And then they come back, and if you are an ANC politician, you say, okay, let me pass a law to do what the Germans are doing, or what the Swedes are doing, or what the Americans or the Chinese are doing. And then when they start to sit down, the people say, are you out of your mind? This is not England, this is not Switzerland. I think that's what the ANC finds itself in. They loved the healthcare service in the United Kingdom. I lived in the United Kingdom for many years. I had political asylum in the United Kingdom. So I had the benefits of the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. But you know what? I paid for it. People thought that for outsiders think that it's free. Well, anyone who works in the United Kingdom has to contribute to it. So it's not free. But there's hardly any unemployment in the United Kingdom. So the whole population contributes. We have, 40% unemployment. So how is that 40% going to contribute to the universal health care? So it's very easy to go and look at what foreigners do and think, I would like to do the same. But it's and it's very wise to say, I would like to do the same, but it's very unwise to try and replicate it.
The timing suggests, though, JP, that the ANC believes this will benefit them in some way in the election, exactly 2 weeks before the election. This is not unintentional. Is there any mechanism that you see that can take the ANC to 50% on the 29th of May? Because the polls have been quite consistent, between 41% and the high 40s perhaps, and we see a gradual increase in the ANC's polling of the last 8 or so weeks in these daily polls, so there's a bit of a strengthening. But is there any mechanism, NHI, bill or other, that you think can get the ANC over the 50% line on the 29th?
I honestly don't know, and I wouldn't like to guess. It's 2 weeks and 2 days, then we will know the answer. Enough to say that, parties do these kinds of things. Yesterday, Biden in the US quadrupled import levies on products from China, particularly electric motor cars. Why is Biden doing it? It is a very stupid economic thing to do, but he's doing it for political reasons. So that, that's what politicians do when the chips are down and the stakes are high. And the chips are down, the election is in 2 weeks, and the stakes are high. They are very high. So will it help? That is very difficult to say. I think the one thing we can say with certainty, it will help to mobilize people that would have voted ANC anyway. I think that's the one role it can play. And that may or may not have an impact. We'll see.
Because in an election campaign, Isaac, many communities are watching what politicians say very, very closely. You watch those who are currently in government, and you watch those who might be in government after June, when coalition forming, which we'll talk about a lot today, happens. Now, from the agricultural community, I can imagine that one of the questions is what the relationship will be like between organized agriculture and a new government. But let's just look at the last 5 years. How would you typify the relationship between commercial agriculture and the current government? Is this a government with whom commercial agriculture has some influence? Are there healthy relationships? Can somebody here from Senvest pick up the phone and say, Minister, we have a problem?
Well, probably Wandile knows that more than I do. But I believe that, what we've seen over the past 5 years is the government not letting a good crisis go to waste, in the sense that we've seen a greater role for the private sector. We've seen that in electricity. Basically starting in July 2022, when the threshold on embedded generation was lifted. Whether, I know that was a forced policy, and even what we got in the budget last year with all those incentives put in place for private sector players to invest in electricity generation, that was a crisis mode measure. What are we doing for agriculture? What I'm going to look out for basically is infrastructure spending. In the budget this year, for the next 3 years, 943 billion has been set aside for infrastructure. Electricity, roads, water, those are critical for the sector. And that will define, for me, how the money is rolled out. Hopefully, we're not going to see a repeat of, what we got from the Zondo Commission and all that. And if the next government can really focus on those, I will say that they've done a lot for agriculture.
Infrastructural spend, Wandile, will benefit all South Africans, among them farmers. But the agricultural community has been in boxing mode at some moments over the last decade with government, especially when expropriation without compensation was a hot button issue before the previous election. Would you say that there's been an improvement in the quality of the relationship between agriculture and government? Because as we know, land reform is not really an issue in this campaign as much as it was last time. Does it tell us that the relationship has improved?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, Vladimir. And first, maybe let me pick up to the point that you said to JP, because you talked about the polls as if they are forecasts.
Yes.
They are not.
Sure.
And I do think that as South Africans, we have to be careful about that particular part. Wednesday last week, the Business Day ran an important editorial where he was warning about the methodology and the quality of these pollings. The reason I'm raising this thing, because if we internalize them as forecasts and they don't result to what we see, that may cause another issue. But back to your question as to whether the relationship with agriculture now and then has it improved. I would say it has improved. And even dating back to the point you raised about land reform, their problem was not land reform per se. Land reform, I think widely all South Africans agree that it has to happen, but it was about how do you deliver that. The expropriation was an issue. There were many ideas that were raised. We have in the audience here, Yapi Grobler, he was at ASUF back then. At NDP, they had ideas about how to do those things, and he was muddled up. But also in the recent past, I would say, look at how many people participated in the agriculture and agro-processing master plan. There are people who didn't agree with it, but if you were to look at it in totality to say, does the master plan carry at least 70% or so of the issues that we all struggle with? It does address that, and he had the government, it had academia, it had private sector labor, and I think it exemplifies the improvement in the relationship that has happened over time on tangible things between the government and at least the Department of Agriculture and the others. So things are better.
You and Johan Kirsten wrote an interesting piece in The Conversation last month about the president's speech in State of the Nation, in which he seemed to recognize for the first time that we've made more progress than previously acknowledged in land reform. When he said that 25% of farmland in the country is now owned by black South Africans, and previously the ANC were defending a number of 10%, saying it's only 10%. To what do you credit, just to stay with you for a moment, Wandile, that shift is just to acknowledge that the 30% goal for 2030 is not as far, we're not as far from it as we previously thought?
Yeah, I thought it was an important thing that he acknowledged that, but he did make perhaps maybe a broad statement that could be adjusted, because the president said 25% is owned by black South Africans. But large part of that land is not in black South Africans, it is in the government. So he was conflating the government and black South Africans. But the land is with the, we have tried to understand on where that land come from. You have a lot of private, you have a few private transactions, you have some that the state has actually bought under what is called the proactive land acquisition strategy. You have others that he has done on restitution and the whole manner of things that is there. But I think what it's important for us as South Africans sitting in this room is that in that percentage that the president was talking about, there is roughly about 2.5 million hectares of land that is currently sitting with the South African government under the land holding account. If you could take that, transfer it to South Africans with title deeds, follow it with post-transfer support, good things could happen. To get a sense of how big that land is, Vladimir, think about all of our grains and the oilseeds that we produce in the country. We produce them in about 4.5 million hectares, the summer grains. So you get a sense of how big 2.5 million hectares is. So those are tangible things that one hopes that after the elections, people could be serious and do that. But the acknowledgement of it was an important one because then it allays some of the political fears that some may have capitalized in 10%.
So fears not being realized is, of course, one source of hope for some farmers. But I mean, let's see, the farming community in conversations here and before Nampo is a very resilient community who've not been relying, it seems, on government so heavily over the last few years, who've asked mostly to be left alone. Does it matter who's in government in a month's time for the farming community? We hear constantly that this is a pivotal election, suggesting that the outcome will really determine the future of this country. Do you agree with that assessment that it's a pivotal election, but also for the farming community, does it really matter that much who's in the union buildings?
Well, can I disagree with the expert, Wandile, here? Being a non-expert on agriculture. First, I really don't think South Africa needs land reform.
Why?
I think the debate on land reform, being a political analyst, for me, transferring land from a white person to a black person doesn't add up to land reform. It's a transaction, yes, but it's not. If I understand my economic history of the world, of the modern world, the purpose of land reform, there are essentially three purposes of land reform. One is to get your agriculture to export. So if your agriculture is not exporting and you need to develop your industry, then you have to buy machinery from the outside world. So you have to get your agriculture to export. South African agriculture is exporting already. It's actually a big exporter. I used to be in the Commonwealth Sanctions Committee, so I know how agriculture of South Africa exports because we used to try and block the exports of South African agriculture. So it's exporting already. So you don't need change. Okay, there's always improvement, change of crops, and so on. So it's already doing it. Secondly, you need your agriculture to feed your non-agricultural population. That's one purpose of land reform, so that you reduce the number of people who are in agriculture, but agriculture can feed the population, the non-agricultural population in industry in the urban areas. But South African agriculture is doing that already. And then the third one is if you need workers who are locked up in agriculture, you need them to go and work in industry. Then you need land reform to release that labor force. Wandile, I stand corrected. Aren't these the three main drivers of land reform? Now, if our agriculture is doing them already, what we need, land reform is not what we need, because our agriculture is doing these things anyway. you may want to transfer land from black to white or white to black or whatever, but that's not land reform.
I'd love to hear JP's views on this as well, but Wandile is going to burst. So Wandile,
I'm not going to burst. But with JP, before you jump in, I think I will have to say just a brief word. Because I think, you are right if you are looking at how do we reform in its true sense, not actually in a sense of South Africa. If you say, how do we rejuvenate an agricultural sector, you could use your definition. But in South Africa, you are dealing with two issues here. You have the racial issue, which is that is in, and also you have the economic question. So those are the two objectives that you are dealing with. You cannot have a society like South Africa, as we write in the book, A Country of Two Agriculture. We talk about black farmers making up less than 10% of the commercial output in South Africa. So in as far as the racial inequalities, you do need land reform to say, how do you begin then to deal with that aspect of it? But the second aspect, which is where perhaps also your input is valid on, that land that is sitting in the state hands today, how do we bring that into full production, because it brings the extra inch of growth, the extra inch of jobs, and all of those good things that we do need. But I think given the historical context of South Africa, there's a big, clear justification for land reform to happen. And then perhaps we can take what you have had and add the racial component and then build onto that. But I would not agree with your proposition on this.
JP?
I'm glad Malechi is making the point. Can we leave it there? No, I think in South Africa, with our history, we absolutely need land reform. There's no ways around it. We had more or less a century of inequity, and you've got to fix that. It's as simple as that. We are lucky that land reform stops, if you want, in 1913, because that's what's in the Constitution. That is what was negotiated. Julius Malema and other people would like it to go back 300 years. Fortunately, we don't have to deal with that. We have to deal with what happened post-2013. But I would just like to add this one point, Valdemar. In my own thinking, I draw a very sharp distinction between equity and efficiency. Land reform in this country is about equity. It's not about efficiency. If you want efficiency, just ask the people who are here. They're efficient already. This is a world-class agricultural sector that we have. So don't have to worry about that. It's the equity that we're trying to resolve. Now, what we sometimes do is we say, because there's no efficiency, or we think there's no efficiency, therefore we can't do land reform. That's not going to help us. You've got to do both, and you've got to live with that ambiguity. The agricultural sector, and Wandile's book puts that very well. The agricultural sector, since democracy, has basically doubled, and of that doubling, from 100 to 200, 50% is being exported. That's a world-class sector. I would go as far as saying that my agriculture is much, much more efficient, productive, and competitive than, for example, mining. Happy to take that on with mining people. So we've got a very, very strong sector. Let's keep that. Let's keep on driving the efficiency, but we also have to attend to the equity. And maybe over time that will, dissipate. But for now, that is our generation's task.
Do you think that farmers are regarded as partners in this attempt to achieve better equity by government? We spoke earlier about a softening in tone from government to some extent over the last few years. But do you think, on balance, farmers are seen as partners in this project by the current government?
Not by everybody. By the current government, yes, I would think so. Not by all political players. Some still see farmers as the enemy, and they exploit people and they don't pay proper wages and things like that. I think that is there. But I do agree with Wandile. I think that the wind has changed a bit. The wind has changed a bit. Since COVID, when we had a food crisis and rising food prices and so on, I think there's much more appreciation for farmers and for the agricultural sector. You can, if you come here and you go a little bit fast, speed cop will pull you off. Where are you going? No, I'm going to Nampo. Oh, they look after the food, go. And that tells you something of how I think the mood has changed.
The mood might have changed, Isaac, but there are still risks, and banks need experts at anticipating risks if you want to be profitable.
Yeah.
South African banks are pretty profitable and world-class institutions. So in your environment at Nedbank, there have to be conversations about what latent risks there might be as political change becomes a bigger possibility than in any election since 1994. And I appreciate that polls are not predictions, but the ANC support is at an all-time low. That is established fact. So what risks does a bank like Nedbank see on the eve of an election that might bring a change of government?
Yeah. Before I move to that, I'll just say I agree with Mr. Mbeki more than I agree with Wandile, but I'll rephrase it and say that
You don't want land reform?
we need land reform as much as we need an efficient state. Thinking that, we've got the so-called developmental state model has been pushed a lot. So we need a very efficient state. But just on the role of the banking sector, I mean, banks are part of society. We are partners when it comes to development. And by the way, development is a partnership. It's a communion between the private sector and the public sector. Now, banks will always be ready and willing to be partners in financing the growth of the agricultural sector. But what are the challenges, for instance, that are faced by those emerging commercial farmers, as they are colloquially referred to? That 10%, once they've got access to the land, what other non-financial support do they get? Because, at least from reading a lot of what you've written, they fail a lot. Black farmers fail a lot due to very limited non-financial support, right? So definitely at Nedbank now, we want to be role players in that big scheme of ensuring that it all passes, it all succeeds.
So first a sweet question and then a hard one. So which policies do you hope next government will bring in, specifically when it comes to those issues that matter to farmers? What would be the number one policy on the wish list from a risk management point of view for you guys?
I mean, I'm not going to give you one policy. I'm big on infrastructure, fixing the infrastructure of South Africa, and I watch those numbers, very closely. I can take you back to around 2013, 2014, in the budget, the 3-year rolling numbers. We were still getting big numbers then, about 600 billion, 700 billion over a 3-year period, right? Most of which was spent by the state-owned enterprises between 30 and 35.
Maybe not SAA, but the others.
Yes, absolutely. The critical ones, But we know what happened. And now we've got 943 going forward, right? This incoming government is the one that is going to roll out that 943 billion. And how efficiently is it going to be spent? That will be what I will want to see. Spend it efficiently and sort out the country, because, we're still not off the burning platform. We haven't put out all the fires. We still have a lot of work to do.
When political change happens, and we don't know it will, but it might, there's always the hope of policy improvement and an improvement in implementation as well. But there's also always a small risk of a wild swing into unknown territory, which your risk analysts certainly look at in dark rooms in the Nedbank building in Sandton. Which scenario, Isaac, can you share with us which you really hope we avoid, whoever is in the union buildings in a few months? Because it's not guaranteed who will sit there. So there must be a scenario that you guys are saying, okay, we think this is unlikely, but it would be undesirable.
Yeah. I mean, number one, I'll say that our view is that a grand coalition would be probably the most volatile transition, and a grand coalition simply means that the ANC will have to go with one of the parties. On the extreme right, the DA, extreme left, we've got the EFF. And we've assigned probabilities to those two. And believe it or not, we fear that the ANC is more likely to go with the DA, at least from a policy front. The politics, we don't know. From a policy front, the ANC is most likely to go with the DA, a probability of around 20%. The extreme left, the EFF, that would most likely not happen. We're worried. I pause because,
I think there might
gives
be,
me sleepless nights, I would say.
there might be some people in the room who might also differ with your typification of the DA as extreme right, but anyway.
Well, policy
to the right.
In the South African policy continuum, let me say.
Yeah, and that would be a meeting of minds to some extent on some policy issues, Muletsi, where some in the ANC and some in the DA agree on how to take this country forward. Isaac spoke about the probability of such a coalition. Let's call it, to be generous, a coalition of the centre. One can typify it in other ways as well. Do you think that if, we'll talk about the appetite for such a cooperation agreement in a moment, but do you think that ANC voters will forgive the ANC for that? And do you think DA voters will forgive the DA for that if the two decide to dance after the election? Because the DA has been promising in this multi-party charter that they'll not work with the ANC. And there are many people in the ANC who've also said they'll not work with the DA. But there are also those in both parties who think that this is the way forward to keep the banks happy and Isaac happy. Will the voters of these two parties, ANC and DA, forgive them for cooperating if that is what we're in for?
I think there's a huge exaggeration about the difference between the DA and the ANC. In fact, I think there's an exaggeration about the differences between our three main parties. The noise that the EFF makes, people mistake it for a different worldview. They're very noisy, they're very raucous, they're very rude, and all those things. But actually, they don't necessarily have a very different worldview from that of the ANC or even that of the DA. But taking the ANC and the DA, these are two center-right parties, the two of them. That's how I would classify both the ANC and the DA. They are supporters of the Washington Consensus, those kind of center-right, Western capitalist economic policies and economic ideologies. So in terms of practicality, there isn't really a huge difference between the ANC. So the core electorate of the ANC and the core electorate of the DA are more or less in the same space. Okay, as is pointed out, on the left of the ANC, they are probably much further than the left of the DA. So, but it's on the fringes. It's not at the core of the two parties. So personally, and the ANC veterans, by the way, have already made the point that they would rather, if the ANC has to have a coalition with anyone, they would rather have a coalition between the ANC and the DA. Now, these are the old, wise ANC leaders who have been in the ANC for, you have to be there for 40 years to qualify to be a veteran. I don't think Wandile can make it. But so yeah, I don't. You see, our politics in South Africa are not as polarized as many people think. We have a lot of parties, but most of these parties, I think there are 52 parties contesting the National Assembly. But actually the difference between them is very slight. A lot of it is personality difference, or personality ambition, I should say, rather than really substantive policy difference. So this is what the strength of South Africa is we don't have huge ideological divisions. So that is one of its strengths.
Certainly our political space is less polarized, I'd venture to say, JP, than the US political conversation at
Not
the
even a
moment
comparison.
is much more polarized than ours. And yet, Isaac spoke about the bank's risk appetite. Markets are more likely, right, to react badly to an ANC-EFF pact than to an ANC-DA pact.
Absolutely, especially in the short term.
Talk to us about that, because there are those. Paul Mashatile, Deputy President, has a warmer relationship with Malema than President Ramaphosa, for example. Panyaza Lesufi, the Gauteng Premier, has a more convivial relationship with the EFF than some of his colleagues. Talk to us about your reading of those internal conversations in the ANC about whether they should consider or should not consider to dance with the EFF, because it is one of these scenarios that people speculate about.
Yeah, look, I think the way I read it, let me just say I agree with Moletsi that I think the difference between the ANC and the DA is not nearly as much as we make it. There are differences, let's not fool ourselves. But if you sit down and you must make a coalition agreement between two parties where you accepted their differences and now they've got to work together, it is very possible to do that. Just on that point, in KwaZulu-Natal, the IFP and the DA signed a coalition agreement for the 13 municipalities in which they have a coalition control. It's a very interesting 9-page document, the first in South Africa. It's the kind of thing which is standard in Europe, in Germany, in Holland, now the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries. Here it's new. Our experience with coalitions have really been very bad, because the focus is on who, not on how. Who gets the job? Who is the mayor? Who gets the car? Not how we're going to run things. Now, this agreement in KZN crosses that line. It goes from who to how. And if we can follow that, you can make coalitions work. And we will have to do it, because I think it is inherent in a system of proportional representation that you don't have a majority party. We've now had it. We've had a system since '94, and for 30 years we've had a majority party, and I think in one way or another that era is coming to a close. It has already come to a close at local government level. So we have to learn, we have to get better at doing coalitions. But now your question is, where will the ANC go? I was hoping to duck it. And I think the way I read it, and I could be completely wrong, is there isn't much enthusiasm for a deal with the EFF, certainly not at national level. The two centers of power inside the ANC that wants to go with the EFF is Gauteng, Panyaza Lesufi and his colleagues, and also in KZN. And they may try and do a provincial government between the ANC and the EFF.
In Gauteng, for example.
In Gauteng and in KZN, in those two. But that's about where it stops. And a lot of that will be dependent. Now you get into internal party discipline, and there I think you must watch somebody like Gwede Mantashe. He's a PW Botha of his party. Some of you will be able to appreciate that.
He will not like that you just said that.
No, he wouldn't. But I think there are parallels. And party first, discipline first, and you don't mess around. That's more or less the comparison. So I don't know to what extent Panyaza and our friends in KZN will be allowed to go against the National Executive Committee. Remember, the NEC has already expressed an opinion. The NEC has said they don't want to go with EFF, and they don't want to go with, who's that clown? Gayton McKenzie from the PA. The NEC is very clear about that. So you must be very brave in a political party to go up against that. So let's see how this thing goes. But my fear of EFF ANC coalition is very low down. I worry much more about my knee and the pothole in the road and whatever that.
There's another player, though, Moletsi, in KZN, who was not the presidential candidate for the MK party just 5 months ago, but now is very much Mr. Zuma. They've been doing quite well in by-elections in KZN, and they seem to be a contender, at least in that province, for a decent share of the vote. We don't know how much it will be. Is the bad blood between Mr. Zuma and the ANC such that they're definitely not talking? We know that Mr. Zuma has been talking with Mr. Malema. What is your reading of MK-ANC relationship? Are the wounds still too fresh for them to really sit around the same fire?
Well, I think they're still fighting. The court cases between the ANC and Jacob Zuma and the MK party are still going on, if I'm not mistaken. So there's absolutely no love lost between Jacob Zuma and the ANC, and they say it repeatedly that the two of them don't see eye to eye. Now, for me, what I'd like to get to the bottom of what is Jacob Zuma's grievance against the ANC. I haven't really gotten a handle on that side of the story. I mean, he was removed from being president before the end of the term, but then was my brother. And he is now campaigning for the ANC. So,
although your brother has now left the country for some diplomatic obligations elsewhere in Africa and is suspended his campaigning for the ANC, it seems.
So Zuma is not the first one to be removed from being president before the end of his term.
Yeah.
So that is not sufficient grievance to want to form a new party to oppose the ANC. So I would like to hear more from Zuma himself and from the expert like JP, who are the serious political analysts, unlike myself, who is not a serious political analyst. What is it that Jacob Zuma is aggrieved about? I don't know if JP can help us with that.
No.
JP, you want to duck that one as well?
Yes.
No, so let's say that we don't know what will happen, but we do assume one thing, and that is that there will be more coalition arrangements, maybe not formal agreements, but more coalition arrangements in this country than ever before, come June. Wandile, in your experience, what has the impact been of local level coalition governments on issues like service delivery and the predictability of what ordinary people and agriculture can expect from government? Because in the last 5 years or so, coalitions have become quite prolific, they're widespread. What's the experience been like on the ground?
I don't know if it was Mr. Mbeki or JP who made the point that the experience hasn't been nice in Eastern Cape or in Gauteng. But I think what I think a lot about, beyond on who gets to be in government or not, is the fact that if you have coalition, and indeed, at least in the short term, they did prove to be what we see in Johannesburg or elsewhere for reasons you have outlined. My worry is more on the service delivery side to say then, because unlike Italy or the UK or any of these countries, I mean, Italy always has a new prime minister every other 3 months, but they have a strong civil servant, which in South Africa, at least over the past 15 years.
Strong bureaucracy.
Yeah, strong bureaucracy, and the offices work and everything else gets delivered. And in South Africa, we've seen that being eroded over time. If we had that strong, then you would perhaps maybe matter less who sits where and all of those things. And that's what, for me, worries a lot. And the experience, of course, as the point has been made earlier, in few sections that we have had hasn't been as good. For agriculture, the reason this becomes important is that you have a couple of things that are troubling people today. If you were to ask folks around to say, what is the sentiment in agriculture in general? At least when we measured it at AgBiz at the start of this year, it was quite downbeat. At the end of last year, the sentiment was quite downbeat, and even on the third quarter, we use what we call the AgBiz Agribusiness Confidence Index to measure that. And there were a couple of things that people were raising. One, animal diseases in the sector, municipalities that are not doing their own part. Rural towns are also facing very serious challenges, and without the functional rural towns, you cannot really run seriously the agribusinesses. It also hinders the new entrants that are trying to get into the sector. The roads and the others, those are things that gets to be a challenge. But even within the Department of Agriculture, there's room to improve in certain registration of agrochemicals and all of those things. I'm listing these because they seem as the process as a few minor details, but they become important for running effective agribusinesses and the farming sector. And if then at a political level you have all of these shifting chairs, and below that, the professionals are also perhaps not as sound as we would like, that begins to cause a bit of problems.
Because, Isaac, there might be things that farmers have come to rely on themselves for and each other, but for the management of the country's ports, for example, the private sector can't really fix it. You do need government to do that. Have you seen an improvement on that score when it comes to export volumes and container movements in the Cape Town and Richards Bay Harbour of the last year or so, since these problems with Transnet and Portnet have come to the fore? Is there any progress there to get our produce to markets elsewhere? Because there you need government.
Yeah, the latest news is good. I mean, at least what we're getting from the new Transnet management. I mean, what we know is that now that contract for the expansion and management over 25 years of the Durban Pier 2 terminal has been awarded to that Filipino company, but we know there's a legal dispute there with Maersk. But we can only hope that it's going to be better, because the latest numbers suggest that. Let me just take you back to November last year, when Transnet reported that about 40,000 terminals, containers were waiting to be offloaded at Durban Port alone. And that would take about 3 months. Latest numbers suggest that that backlog has been cut to less than 1 month. That's a big positive, and we need to sort out all these issues. The rail system, earlier I said that the government did not let a good crisis go to waste. We know that now, there's that process to facilitate the utilization of the rail network
for freight
by the private sector. But the issue apparently is very high tariffs that are proposed by Transnet, and we're going to have to sort out that issue, because, for instance, the Durban port is very important, not only for South Africa, but also for Southern Africa. About 40% of the goods going to the SADC countries come through the Durban port. We've seen Mozambique taking some of the volumes, the merchandise, but the Mozambique port is small, so there's a capacity constraint there. We need to sort out Durban. And after the elections, what are we going to see? What government are we going to see? You asked me earlier about our scenarios. Our base case scenario, 70 to 75%, very likely is the ANC either getting a majority, but very slim majority on its own, or going with one of the, or more of the moderate parties, the IFP and all those parties. And in that situation, we would hope that at the very least, we see a continuation of these reform measures that are helping to address all these logistical bottlenecks. At best, accelerate them. Operation Vulindlela, great initiative, coordinated from the National Treasury, progress being made, but we need to see, a lot more being done at a faster pace. And it's all about, passing legislation and all that.
So we're not out of the woods yet, JP. Many reforms still need to happen. Tim Cohen wrote in Daily Maverick, though, this week that this current suspension of load shedding is not a cynical election ploy, as many people believe that it is, but the consequence of very deliberate cooperation between the private sector and government starting July last year to install photovoltaic, is that correct, on so many roofs across the country, and to really reduce our reliance on Eskom. Are you given hope by this definite deepening in the cooperation between the private sector and at least this government at least when it comes to electricity. Is this a good sign?
I think you can expand it from electricity most definitely. That is the furthest advance. But it's also happening in railways, happening in ports, and it will happen in quite a big way in water. You can take those 4 industries, they're called network industries. You can take those 4 network industries, and what is happening and will continue is that we'll move away from the current dispensation of a state monopoly that runs it. Over the years, we developed a monopoly called Eskom in power. We developed a monopoly called Portnet in ports, and so on and so forth. These monopolies are going to disappear. And what we will get is a hybrid model where you would still have a state enterprise, a previous monopoly, now just an ordinary enterprise, not having monopoly power, working with private sector companies to fix things. I think that train has left the station. And we see it dramatically in power. I think very, very few people in South Africa appreciate what happened in power. In June 2021 and 13 months later, in July 2022, Ramaphosa made 2 TV addresses to the nation on power, on electricity. And in those 2 addresses in 13 months, he completely deregulated the South African electricity industry. We've gone from a state monopoly to a monopoly that's being smashed. We've gone from one controlled price countrywide where the market will set the price, and so we can carry on. But so I think that one is done. But I think, Waldemar, it is important to say 2 things. One, the government moves slowly. The government doesn't move quickly. So one has to discount that. I'll give you an example. The president, when he became president, the current Mr. Ramaphosa, was very gung-ho about the infrastructure fund. He really pushed it. He used the power of his office. And I can remember about 2 years later, in a meeting, he was just exasperated that it took, after 2 years, the infrastructure fund was still not there. It's now up and running and working. So things take time, even if the president is behind it. That's the one point. The second point comes from a lesson from Potchefstroom. A friend of mine who died last year of cancer had a first sexual experience when she was a first-year student at Potchefstroom with a final year theology student. And she described it, I'm going to use the Afrikaans, she described it as a nag van onbeholpe gevroetel. Or a night of uncoordinated fumbling. That's the best I can do. Now, a lot of that will play out in this process. Let me give you an example. It is now quite clear that Transnet is keen in allowing the private sector on railway lines, freight railway lines. I think they're now busy with their 3rd attempt to come up with a set of proposals which is acceptable to them, but also acceptable to the private sector. And there is your uncoordinated fumbling. What is the right move? What must you do now? And if you do this now, what then? And we must allow ourselves a little bit of what is the word, patience, to work through these things. We don't have that experience. We don't have that experience, and you don't want to end up where England and Wales are with their water. When Margaret Thatcher came in, she deregulated all water affairs in England and Wales. There were a number of water authorities. They were turned over to the private sector debt-free. Now all those water authorities, all, are bankrupt. The private sector shareholders don't want to put in money. They're completely indebted because what happened over the period? The shareholders took dividends by way of bank loans. Didn't reinvest, didn't do the maintenance, didn't keep up to standard, up to pace with new technologies. So jy wil nie 'n gat van jou maak in die langtermyn nie. Jy moet 'n bietjie die goed vooruit dink. You've got to think a little bit ahead and work through the results. Learn from the rest of the world. So yes, I think the policy is clear. I think the direction is clear. The momentum is there. But A, it will take time, and B, we have to learn now to do this. I had to learn to walk off a crutch at my age. I mean, it was deeply humiliating. But you have to learn to do that, and that's where we are.
So it does sound, Wandile, as if we eventually do the right thing. We've exhausted all the alternatives. From a policy point of view, I mean, there's cooperation here between government and private sector, but it took a while.
It does take a while, but I think it's delivered. And there's an important point here that both JP and Isaac are making about the reforms that are underway. And business has been part and parcel of that. I mean, if you just think about those work stream that BLSA and BUSA have been talking, people can say it's a discussion that is just happening there, but it is bearing fruits. And I think those are important things. The key thing then going forward is that after the election, whoever comes into government, or it's a continuation of the current government, we have to maintain the momentum of all of those things. Yes, that is at a national level, but also even at a sectoral level, there are certain things that have been discussed for quite some time, but now we're beginning to see some fruits and some of the collaborations. I talked about the issues related to master plans earlier. If you talk to agricultural people today, there's what we call the Agricultural Registrar's Office. That's where you register all your new agrochemicals and all that kind of stuff. There was a capacity issue, and if you talk to livestock farmers, they will tell you something about Act 36. All of those things now, there's beginning to be capacity that private sector brings into those offices. Slowly by slowly, there is a bit of delivery there. The one thing that we need to do then in the farming side is to say, how can we tap into the private sector expertise in taking even those available lands, putting them into full production, thinking about the blended finance in a more ambitious way, and making sure that it delivers that. Because what that does, takes us back to Mr. Mbegi's points of saying, let's continue to improve food security and the exports. Because with what we are doing, Vladimir, and he made the point that we are food secure, but I'm not sure how many people in the audience appreciate that point. Because if you think about the sub-Saharan Africa region, we are the most food secure country there. In Africa, second. We were exporting from JP in 2022 about half of that. But if you think about of our produce, but if you think about 2023 figures, we probably exported about close to 60% in value terms, a record $13.2 billion. It's good for the national level, but then the question is to say, how do we continuously do that effectively going forward and building onto those points in a more inclusive way? And I think this slow process towards the right directions, I think we have to build on.
So this sounds all very positive, but in 2021, let's see, the upflaring of violence in KZN and Gauteng showed South Africans what could happen. Yeah. There was a lot of violence. There were several hundred deaths. There was also remarkable cooperation between communities, which were highlighted in the news media. But it did show us that stability cannot be assumed as a given. Do you have any concern that as results are announced on the 31st of May, that there will be disruptive elements that will choose to use that opportunity to, again, bring back those horrible days of the KZN riots? The police seem to be on high alert at the moment for uncertainties, but do you think that there's a reason to at least be a little bit worried that there could be disruptive moments?
Well, personally, no. I don't think we have that kind of a risk. We see in other African countries that elections trigger a lot of instability. If you look at Kenya, for example, elections trigger a lot of upheavals in Kenya and in several other African countries. I don't think this is a problem that South Africa has. We have a much deeper problem in South Africa, which is our development model, let me put it that way, has plateaued, has reached its plateau. We need a new way to go to the next plateau in terms of development. That's really our problem. What those riots showed in July 2021, this massive young unemployed male population in South Africa is a powder keg. But the problems of that population are not difficult to solve. They need employment, formal employment, so that they can start their families and so on, and they need that stability. So what we're faced with in South Africa, leaving aside the railways and the electricity and so on, The private sector can do only so much about those. We need a new development model for South Africa that will, today, according to government figures, more than 50% of South African households are receiving welfare. Now, a society like that, it really is in deep trouble. Now, you don't know what can trigger the instability. If half of your households are receiving welfare, it means you are an unstable country. Anything can trigger. You know, Orlando Pirates beating Sundowns, that would trigger an instability. So anything can happen. So we really in South Africa, and forums like this one, have to look at what should we do to move our development model to the next level. Because the people who are here, they control huge assets, they employ lots of people, but that has more or less reached the ceiling. We have to break through that glass ceiling to start to become like the Chinas of this world, the South Koreas of this world.
And there you need policy reform.
Oh, you need huge policy, and you need political. You see, you don't just need economic policy reform, you need political change. Because the model we have is not just at the economic level. It dovetails with its political partners. So in a way, we need political change in South Africa, not the reform that the ANC talks about. You know, the ANC tells you, oh, we need renewal to do what? More of the same. No. End up with half of our population on social welfare. No, the ANC is happy with that model.
They regard it as a sign of success.
Oh yeah, they regard it as success. It actually is failure. So we need a new political culture and new political thinking and new political parties which don't see social welfare as being success. They see it as failure, and they must come up with solutions that uplift South Africa. If you look, for example, recently the World Bank published the Human Capital Index. Out of 170 countries, South Africa is number 132. We are 12 countries below other sub-Saharan countries like Kenya, like Botswana, like Mauritius, in terms of our human capital index. Now we have to break out of that model, and this is not happening. And I'm not seeing the conversation about how do we break out of this.
Mr. Mbeki, thank you so much. On that note, I'm going to open the floor for a few questions. We don't have much time, but if I can see by a show of hands, and this will not be a scientific or fair process, whether there's anybody who has a pressing question, please direct it at a specific member of the panel if you can, and please avoid long speeches. Are there any hands for questions to our panel? Not yet. Courage is building. There's one over there. Thank you so much. A second question. Can we take 3 hands, perhaps? A second question over there. And a third hand. Going. 3. Thank you very much. 1, 2, 3. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Agri Manjana from NALFASA, National African Farmers Association of South Africa. I would tend to agree with the young man there. A lot of people, they tend to think that we are going to the coalition government. I don't think so. I still strongly believe that ANC is still gonna be above 50%. Why I'm saying so? If you trace all our elections from 1994, ANC got the majority of the support from the so-called Uzuma non-clever blacks, the Mamdwakas from the rural areas, the people from Umtata, the people from in Transkei, KwaZulu-Natal, and so on. The people who have been shifting this vote is so-called clever blacks. These clever blacks, what they have done, especially to the last elections, they just stopped. They didn't go to the election to vote. Hence, the ANC dropped the vote. And it's the same thing. Zuma was eating with the non-clever blacks. Cyril is eating with the clever blacks. These clever blacks that Cyril is eating with, they wouldn't allow that Cyril must lose, because they're going to lose. And in addition, Cyril is eating with the clever whites. Those clever whites, they don't want Cyril to lose. So I don't see the ANC going below 50%. Thank you.
Okay, next year you should be on the panel. Thank you. Two more comments or questions from the gentleman in the corner and then the lady in the second row, and then we're wrapping. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Lennox Plykis. I'm from Pulse Partners in Agri-Land Solutions. More directed to Wandile. I think it's well recognized that there was a private sector contribution with the state in terms of putting together the AAMP. And one of the enablers, I think that was discussed at AMMP level, was blended finance as an enabler to expedite the access of black farmers into commercial agriculture. The question through you, as somebody who's obviously also participating and advising the minister on some of these transformation initiatives within agriculture, why are we not seeing the rollout of the blended finance? Why are it's public funds that we are not transparent about in terms of what's the progress of its rollout? You cite big numbers at announcements, but you don't cite progress of implementation. Perhaps maybe from your side, would like to hear an indication from that one. Yeah, because I believe as Pulse, it is practical things that we do that will change. It's not only what politicians do. It's practical things on the ground that will contribute to the social change we want to see in South Africa. Thank you.
Lennox, bye, donkey. And then last question from the lady in the second row.
Good day, everyone. I'm Robin Skitter. I'm an agricultural journalist at OFM. My question is, what can we expect, regardless of whichever party is in power, regarding support for the agricultural sector when it comes to climate uncertainties? What we can expect, and is there any support?
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
So perhaps if panelists would volunteer to comment on the first remark from Agri about the ANC having plans to end up above 50%, whatever the polls say. Any volunteer for that one before we go to Wandile? JP, you're laughing. Is that a sign that you want to say something or that you don't want to say something? Okay. Muletsi.
No, I think we shouldn't be too hard on the opinion polls. They do serve a purpose. Okay, we have to take their message with a critical eye. The reality, though, was the last local government elections. In the last local government elections, for the first time, the national tally of the ANC was about 46%. Now, many people say you can't compare general election to local election, etc., etc. Probably true, but it had never happened before. So for me, I think that's where I get my message from. Yes, I agree with the speaker that the so-called clever blacks are the urban population. But the urban population of South Africa today, of all races, are the majority of the people of South Africa. So the rural population, who he is saying the ANC depends on, are only about 30% of the population of South Africa. So at the end of the day, this is what the future of the country is. Even the rural population is moving to the cities, which is why we have all these huge informal settlements. So the indication, the real indication was the November 2021 election where the ANC, for the first time, the national tally in the local government was below 50%.
And the ANC's majority dropped below 50% in all the big cities in the last election as well. So the urban centres are moving away. Wandile, just your comment on Lennox's question about the rollout of these agricultural plans.
Yeah, sure. Let me be quick, and I'll start with the point that was made also earlier on, and I know the time. I'm looking at the time. The first one on the issue of welfare, and I do think that as South Africans sitting in the room, we must appreciate this. Before the whole COVID support thing came into place, many people that were supported, folks that cannot work, that are old people, and the others are young people. So they're usually outside the working age. But still, that doesn't take away the fact that we need to ensure that the population is empowered so that they are not dependent on the state side. But I do think that we have to reflect the fact that these are people that are usually ordinarily outside that active working population side. To Lennox's point, let me wear my hat maybe as an advisor to government on a few things. As best as I can tell, whether policy, and this links with your point, Robin, the minister and the others have agreed that post-elections, if they return to office, there's a few things that they want to focus on. One, they say they are committed on releasing, finally, with title deeds, that 2.5 million hectares of land. That takes time, but at least it is there, and that has been said publicly. The second aspect on the blended finance, why it has been slow, I think, Lennox, I can take that in as something that the DG, along with those that are rolling the blended finance, the banks and the land bank, can perhaps maybe refine some of the difficulties that are there. Because I take that point seriously when it comes to PALs, because in our thinking at AgBiz and elsewhere, when we think about how partnerships should work, Vladimir, we usually consider PALs, what UOMNIC is doing, for example, at CERNIC, and many other of the colleagues as the models of how partnerships should actually work. So you would assume that organizations like that should be at the forefront. Two last things that will also be a focus is the issue of the animal diseases and livestock health. That's something that in the policy will be out there. And of course, other points that have been made earlier around the infrastructure. Thanks.
Thank you, Wandile. A bright red screen has just popped up that says time's up, I think, right there. So, Robin, I don't think we're going to get to your question about climate. Please engage the speakers after the session. Just as we wrap, and thank you to this wonderful panel. Perhaps if we can just have a round of applause for the panel. As we walked in, there was a lady who came quite early, Tannie Blanche van Reitz, dink ek in die Vrystaat, wat daar in die tweede ry sit. En ons praat 'n bietjie en ek sê vir haar dis interessante tye en sy sê gaan ons die interessante tye oorleef. Interesting times, but are we going to survive the interesting times? And I think it's a Chinese proverb that says, if you want to really cause problems for somebody, you say, may you live in interesting times. JP, you've been to China recently. Are we going to survive the interesting times?
Yes. Yes. Look what agriculture has survived since 94.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the example.
We always do. JP, Isaac, Moletsi, Wandile, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much. And to the audience for being so present in the conversation, thank you for that. An award of some kind is going to be handed over, I think, by Francois. Francois, dankie vir die geleentheid.
So I always wanted to meet Vladimir Pelser and his nephew, Valdemar Putin. So. Wandile. So before I do the handing of the check, what struck me is I said in the beginning that South Africans are wonderful people. Can you imagine if there was 5 politicians sitting here, what this conversation would have been like? And what you've seen now is 5, I think, extraordinary South Africans, but ordinary South Africans, having a wonderful conversation. And even differing from each other, but in a civilized and an intelligent way. That's the people who really govern South Africa, not the politicians. So we'll make it. So we have from Senvest side, we have the Agri Rewards. It's a thank you, a rewarding of our client base. But on top of that, we have the Agri Plus rewards. Now, if you want something done, certainly in South Africa, you go to the agricultural sector. And the structured way that happens in every boerevereniging, they sort out things. They build roads, they bring water, they look for security, they handle social issues. There's no other sector that does it the way that they do it. And we wanted to contribute to that. So on top of the rewards, we do the Agri Plus rewards. This, on the business that they make, we give them the money because in every region, there's different needs, and they can spend it wisely as they think. Now, we do it this afternoon to the monastery group. Philip, you would come down, a wonderful example of excellent people who works selfishly in their communities. And this will, I hope, go a long way in fulfilling your needs.